come to to the occult bookshop and you're looking for something on the Jewish shelf, you may decide that instead of going to the section on Sufism or Buddhism, that the Jewish section is just as spiritually tantalizing. That was my goal with this translation. I want to speak to world seekers and Jews that are in and out of the bookshop and also the bookshelf. Now, the Chabad connection is important. I said this is not a Chabad translation, which means that the other person who was missing, who was on the boat, who went AWOL, going back to my earlier question, was the Alter Rebbe. Shneur Zalman of Liadi was a student, a Talmid Muvhak, the most devoted disciple of the Vitebsker. He was his most prized student, the founder of Chabad. Thank you. And he's known in this material as the Rashaz, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, that's his handle. Chabadniks refer to him as the Alter Rebbe, right, as the great Rebbe who started the lineage of 7 generations of Hasidic Rebbeim. The reason why I bring it up and I say this is not Chabad is because this project is also a counter-spiritual history. Meaning that Shneur Zalman of Liadi made it to Turkey, to Istanbul, according to some sources. It's a very long journey from Eastern Europe all the way to Eretz HaKodesh. Around Istanbul, when they had to switch ships, he turned around and went back. And there's a lot of speculation as to why he turned around and went back, but it's very clear from volume 3 of this series that I'm going to be publishing soon, from the correspondence, the Igrot, that it was an issue of a difference in spiritual practice that translated into D'ma'ot Tzedakah. That is to say that the tzedakah that would come from the diaspora to support the Tiberian community became a point of contention, and it was a function of who had power and authority, because the Hasidim were sending their support to the Holy Land to support the Tiberian community. Shneur Zalman of Liadi ended up turning around and going back because they were without a spiritual leader. They were doing it through correspondence, which is what was taking place. Shneur Zalman of Liadi, between 1792 and 1796, ends up disseminating and sharing pamphlets that become known as the Tanya. And this is the beginning of the institution that we know of and we call Chabad. Okay? And it was being born at the same time as these mystics left Eastern Europe behind, the Vitebsker and the Kalisker, and sailed all the way to Tiberia. And they founded a different approach to spiritual practice, which was much more ecstatic, much more focused on the heart and on embodiment, head-centered through a somatic experience, as opposed to Chabad. And again, these are oversweeping generalizations. There's nuances everywhere, but the overall picture is Chabad's approach that Shneur Zalman was articulating at this time and becomes very clear in the Tanya was much more of a cognitive spiritual experience that begins with the head. And there was a huge debate between those two types of spiritual practice. And Tiberius, on a certain level, their approach has been forgotten, and because it never became institutionalized. So my project with my good friend Nehemiah, with other Chaverim who've helped and studied this with me, my project in staying in Tiberias was to create a spiritual counter history to Chabad, and to say that there is another way of practice and there is something else that's authentic, that actually also in our own locution would be an exemplar of a horizontal community that is radically egalitarian. They wouldn't use that terminology, but I will, anachronistically, because it was co-led by 2 leaders, not one. In Eastern Europe, remember that the Rebbe is the focus of the Chatzer. The Chassid, the devotee, comes to the courtyard in the 3rd generation, entering the courtyard to see and have office, spiritual intimacy with the Rebbe. And it's a vertical relationship, and that's the way that the Chabad world ends up growing. And it's a dynastic succession. You succeed as a Rebbe in that succession pattern through bloodlines. It didn't work that way in Tiberias, and that's one of the reasons why the official lineage, the Shalshelet, ended. Both the Kalisker and the Vitebsker had children, and they specifically said, we don't think our children are spiritually elevated or refined enough. You imagine as a parent, a Jewish parent saying this about your child? I don't think my child is ready to take over the family business. Could you ever imagine?
I just have to interrupt because, of course, the common Jewish joke is the three Jewish mothers talking about their kid. My daughter's a doctor. Oh, very nice. My other daughter's, a lawyer. Oh, very nice. My son's a rabbi. What sort of job is that for a nice Jewish child? Right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
but this is the opposite.
It is. It's astonishing because the depth of the refinement of this community, the attunement to the subtleties, and maybe with that we'll go into some of the text together to see just the nuances that they're playing with to suggest that they're like an onion. If you imagine the soul as an onion, that there are layers that have to be peeled away to go to deeper and deeper places of refinement. And they were able to be humble enough and transparent enough to look at themselves in the mirror and ultimately to be in that conversation with the ultimate mirror of the Holy One. And to then say, respectively, both of our sons are not spiritually refined enough to carry forward this community. And so for all intents and purposes, on an exoteric level, the way things looked on the outside of the onion, that was the end of Tiberian Hasidism. It stopped there. I contend, and you'll see in this, I believe it's in this volume, I'm in a lot of conversations with people who don't agree with me, and that's what makes Judaism interesting. The most renowned Bar Plukta is Jonathan Garb, Professor Gershom Scholem, Professor of Kabbalah at Hebrew University. He has a phenomenal article that he generously contributed to the volume. The volume has a reader's guide, which you really should dig into, and I think Reb David Chevre has read some of it. But he challenges this term as to whether or not there is such a thing as Tiberian Hasidism at all. Because if there's no dynastic succession, if there's no Kehot press, there's no 770 in Crown Heights, it's an equivalent address in Tiberias. And for all intents and purposes, for the historian of religion, Tiberian Hasidism doesn't exist. I challenged him, and I say to him, if you look, especially in Karl and Stolen, for example, if you look in Piazetzner, these are all different sects of ecstatic, heart-based Hasidism. If you look in Ruzhin, you look in Slonim, these are all going to be in volume 5 of the series. It's clear that they are preserving, interpreting, and carrying forward the subtle, heart-based, ecstatic approach to spiritual practice that is found and quoted directly from Tiberius. But they don't necessarily say this is Tiberian Hasidism. I do, because I have an agenda. And I've told you what my agenda is, to create a counter-spiritual history to Chabad. And hopefully that's the one thing that I'll be remembered by when I leave this mortal coil. It'll say, Allah Litiveria. In Leonard Cohen's tombstone, it says, Allah Lamarom. He went upwards. I went to the side. I went to Tiberia. And maybe, so Reb David, is that a reasonable a beginning for us to go into the text, unless people have some specific clarifying questions about this very, very general Hakdama? I could go on for hours because I've been in this place for 2 decades, so I don't want to...
I think the important piece there that I just want to sort of highlight, maybe in slightly different language, right? And, I think, there are a lot of people who know this stuff at all, who think that the ecstatic begins and ends with Abu Lafia, right? And a lot of Jewish community.
Does everybody know who Abu Lafia is? Abraham Abu Lafia, the 13th century ecstatic mystic, right? Okay.
So he had, thank you. We were both sort of explaining these things are so normal, right? and we have to remember to translate that. But that, there's a way, Rabbi Glazer and I have certainly discussed this, that and we've discussed in this class as well, right, that regular Judaism, synagogue Judaism, is sort of, hatched to dispatch, from birth to death, and it is holding the body of the community, but that the soul of the community in a lot of our synagogues, because they have all these other functions, educating people, getting them to a bar bat mitzvah, taking care of life cycle events, that this ecstatic other side of Judaism has had periods where it's really been dormant. And
you described it really well when you called it in that conversation about Hinduism as householder Judaism. That's what most of us have experienced, and that's the reason why so many of us have left it, because we're looking for something, in the inner sanctum, not just householder, right?
Yeah, I think that's important, and we're in an exciting time because Joy Weissenberg. There's a whole bunch of people who are trying to get us back to this heart-based thing, and we can go back to Art Green, we can go to Reb Zalman, and so many others. But there's just a shift in time. So we've been reading this text, which I'm going to share on the screen, which really is about a very modern concept that this could come out of DBT, out of dialectical behavioral work. You are where your mind is, and what you think is where you are, and that focusing your mind on consciousness itself and looking at how we think is this path to begin to reconnect to God and ourselves at this deepest level, and of getting to a place of emptiness that's not filled with distractions, that allows us to rise up. So let me begin to share the screen here, and hopefully this will work. Sometimes my share screen's a little bit challenging. So do you guys see this?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
That's great.
So we're going to start here. So we've been talking about all these forms of consciousness. We've been talking about the how attractive doing the wrong thing is. That there's energy associated with all sorts of stuff that we after we do, we wish we hadn't done. Having that extra drink, opening the fridge that extra time, letting your anger get ahead of you. They all of these sort of outer forms, because of an attraction, and that our job is part of our job as human beings, and for this conscious community is this other piece. So we'll begin. And Aubrey, do you want to read? Do you want to invite people to read? How do you want to handle this?
Maybe what I'll do is, because it's very dense, is I'll read and make some comments, and then we'll go through maybe a paragraph at a time, and then open it up for questions. Because again, the way that we translated this, which was not without controversy, it's a form of translation called Intercalated Translation. It's very much influenced by Steinsaltz, who translated the Talmud. Many of you may have known that. I think when we were in seminary, David, that was the thing that we were forbidden, at least at JTS, to bring into our Talmud shiurim. If you were caught with Steinsaltz, you get expelled from class. But I used to love Steinsaltz. I did it in Hebrew, so I thought it was great because I got to work in my Ivrit, and they said, no, you have to have the regular Vilna Shas. If I see anyone with Steinsaltz, then you get kicked out of class. So I've used that approach to try to fill in the blanks, because as Reb David said earlier, and Peter was asking this question, these drashot were written in Hebrew, and it's very possible that they were also delivered in Hebrew, because remember, they were in the Holy Land, and there's very little Yiddish in these drashot. It comes up in one of the disciples of the Kalisker, who will be volume 4. His name is Svi Hershov Tzmoirich. He wrote a commentary on an ecstatic prayer called Baruch She'amar, and there are places where he inserts a little bit of Yiddish here and there, a couple words, but very little. So it's clear that he's doing it to say, and this is what I mean. If you don't catch my drift, let me say it in the Mamalashan. But otherwise, we're in the Holy Land, and part of being in the Holy Land is using Lashon HaKodesh. That was very important to them as part of the reason for this spiritual renaissance taking place in this specific time and place. So the Vitebsker is picking up on this earlier section. Remember, we're in Acharei Mot, after the death of the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and there is a whole history that precedes this about their deaths from the Hasidic tradition actually as being not punishment, but a sign of Dveikut, of merging with the divine, and a sign of spiritual elevation. Just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this, because we're delving deeper into, as I said, the layers of the soul. And he opens up by making a juxtaposition between a teaching in Pirkei Avot, the Mishnah that we actually are traditionally reading during this time, of the counting of the Omer as a process of spiritual refinement. Just remember that as well. It's not by chance that in Acharei Mot he starts with a juxtaposition with Pirkei Avot, and he starts right away and asks the question, Have mitpalel b'shlom Hashem malchut, Avot 3:2. What does it mean to pray for on behalf of the regime, pray for the welfare of the regime. And the specific word that he's most interested in here that comes up in what we're about to read now together, just to give you the background, is Shlomo Shel Malchut. Okay, so Malchut is translated as the regime, but if you're attuned to Kabbalah, which he's expecting us to be, Malchut is also the Sphira, that is the sphere of divine consciousness, which sometimes is translated well as the ground of being. It's the place of embodiment. So here's where he's starting now, okay? He makes a distinction which becomes as well the basis for what Shneur Zalman of Liadi does through the entire Tanya. So if you've studied Tanya before, this will sound very familiar to you, but there's a subtle shift and a difference here in terms of what he's doing. He says there is this distinction here between ki hachiluk hu sheben nefesh adam hasichli v'nefesh habehimi. כי נפש הבהמי הוא נפש החיוני המגדל הזה המתהווה כולם לא נבראו כי אם לצורך הגוף שהם הצורת וחיות הגוף כמו שבמאמר ורוח הבהמה הירדת היא למטה. So I wanted you to hear the Hebrew, which is included in the critical edition in the back of the text, which is another important feature of this edition. There is a distinction between the inner soul and the outer soul, between the nefesh habehimi, the nefesh hasichli, and the nefesh habehimi. He says that the latter, that is the outer soul, involves the vital soul that is concerned with the functions of nourishment, of fostering, of growth, of craving. Right, as Reb David said, you open the fridge and you want to not just have a taste of the Ben and Jerry's, but you want to eat the entire wavy gravy container. Okay, he says all of which exist for the sake of the body, the goof. And these forces constitute the basic life force of the body, as Scripture teaches, as he reads here in the book of Kohelet, which I translate extremely interpretively. Then the vibratory expression of the sensual soul descends to the lowest level. However,
I'm laughing because that is such an interpretive. I think it's fair, but
if you look on the note, right, note 41 says literally this is the way the verse is normally understood. And you have to remember that these resonances are playing in the mind of the listener all the time. In English, you know, we have 750,000 words in English. Do you know how many we have in Hebrew? Peter, what were you saying? What did you think?
A lot less.
Yeah, a lot less. Take off a zero, about 75,000. Okay? So what's interesting is that even when you read a verse in Scripture, which they all knew by heart, it literally means who knows if a human's life breath rises upward and if a beast's breath does sink down into the earth. That's the way that it's literally understood. The Vitebsker here is playing with this and suggesting that there's an inner relationship that, of course, runs counter to the contextual meaning of the scriptural verse. There's no doubt that he's taking an ingenious moment of spiritual inspiration. He's taking this verse and he's not questioning whether the soul that's embodied in a human being has a different trajectory than the soul that's embodied in a beast. And that's one of the issues that Kohelet has, because Kohelet, Ecclesiastes on its own terms, does not even know of an afterlife. The mystical reading of this text through the Zohar and through the Hasidic tradition knows otherwise, that the soul is always on a series of journeys. And so the vibratory expression of the sensual soul descends to the lowest level. However, through its evolutionary ascent of the body, these qualities of vitality, of nourishment, growth, and craving can also ascend. So you have to appreciate for a moment that just as the body is elevated, so too can the soul be elevated. This is a basic premise of Hasidism that has been woven ingeniously into a very complex and subtle drasha, which comes down to a foundational precept in Hasidism. The Baal Shem Tov teaches that the Hasidic avodah, the avodah is avodah shebegashmiyut. Everything that we do is about elevating material, corporeal, embodied existence and finding a way to allow it to uplift us, not to pull us down. So even when you get that midnight call to the freezer for the wavy gravy and the Ben and Jerry's is calling you, he's saying, and the Pia Zetzner says later, it's a pure chusei hanefesh. It's like the bubbling up that happens inside, the tingling of that sensual soul that's giving you an opportunity to actually uplift the body. even though we normally think, as Reb David said, sometimes it can take us down and we can't get back up. It's really an opportunity to elevate. Shneur Zalman in the Tanya sees this as a kind of cosmogonic struggle, that you're constantly struggling with that animal, bestial soul inside of you, and you're trying to dominate it and you're trying to control it. The Vitebsker's approach is different. He's saying there's a synergistic system working here, and that's why I talked about it like an onion. That there's just layers, but it's a very supple kind of an onion. So you can peel away the layers, and you just continue to kind of, it's like a mise en abîme. It's just sort of like, when you're in the, remember when you used to go to the hairdresser or to the barber back in those days? And they'd show you what your hair looked like from the back in the mirror of the mirror of the mirror of the mirror, right? It would just keep reflecting. That's called mise en abîme. That's what the way he sees the way that these two elements of the soul interact with each other. The nefesh behemi and the nefesh sichli, the inner and the outer soul, are continually concatenating and rippling off of and through each other. And he goes on. Should we just stop here for a moment before we go to the next part? Because I've unpacked a lot.
Yeah. There's a lot in there. It certainly makes me think. I mean, again, this is these two different schools, as you were talking about, an alternate history. But I mean, it makes me think of Pajiska a little bit, right? I mean, and Reb Bunam, going to the opera, but also just that whole that whole focus. And my first career as a chef. And the whole point of a chef, right, actually, when you think about, like, making food look pretty, it's to help people overcome the nefesh habehimi, right? There's a flirtation, there's a tension in high-end food between pure pleasure, which is sort of what you're charged with, but forcing the diner into a mentality of gratitude and a focus and an awareness and of shifting, right? I mean, chefs have been very right. How do you elevate this stuff? And so I think that to me, right, that's always, Pajiska too, these schools that are not, this is not Puritanism, right? It recognizes you can't avoid this stuff, and yet we have a real ability to elevate it, and I think that's important, right? Because if your Puritans are one side of it, we're almost the opposite. We doubt as a society or culture that there is a soul having this experience. I mean, that would probably be the larger cultural worth, and to have this middle ground that takes seriously the possibility, I think that's very useful for us as modern people.
It is, and I love your analogy. As the chef, as an artist, in a sense, these Hasidim see themselves as ritual artists, and that the opportunity to be able to elevate that is arising from this bubbling up of the desire just to consume, this beautiful plated experience that you're about to eat, sometimes may also mean that you don't actually even eat the food in front of you, but it leads you into a contemplative experience. The issue is that if you were a Chabadnik, you would use that as an opportunity to contemplate a verse, and you would go off into the cosmos through your head and through your mind. But what I feel is that even though this is a recognition of a desire within your outer soul, it's an opportunity to go deeper to the inner soul, right? And here, what he's suggesting as we go into the next paragraph is that let me just say one more thing about the inner and the outer. The inner soul really is the subtle level of the nefesh, as opposed to the outer soul, which is the gross level. Now, let me explain what I mean, because I've imported these terms a little bit inspired by Vedanta, but I think it helps us understand that there are these different levels that really help us try to clarify what's going on within the world of Kabbalah and the Sfirot. Now, on one foot, Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism that leads up to and supports the Hasidic revitalization and revolution. But the Hasidim were interested in taking this understanding of the cosmos and bringing it into a psycho-spiritual relationship with the way that you live in the world, and not tripping out into the cosmos, into the cosmic spheres as much, because Kabbalah by the 1700s was becoming very elitist and esoteric. in a way that wasn't helpful to everyone. The Hasidic revolution was to take that feeling, the hergesh, and to give it to everyone. That is to say, you don't have to be a master of Kabbalah to dance to a Rikudin de Kedusha, to have a holy dance in a tavern, to feel the way that a nigun lifts you up or that a story transforms you. The masters, like Reb David said, the master chef is the one who knows how to plate the experience and to set the table, but then to bring you around the tish, which was a focal point of the Hasidic ecstatic experience, and to allow you to open up and to enter into the experience, whether or not you are schooled in the highest levels of Kabbalah. Okay, but what I'm suggesting here is he's alluding to it. That's the way he's opening with Pirkei Avot. Hava hitpalel b'shlomo shel malchut. He wants us to know that an integrated, holistic approach to life. If you want to bring your prayer life into action to be the ground of your being, then make sure that everything is integrated into Malchut. And Malchut really is the gross level. That's the outer soul. If we're making a connection out between the soul and the spheres, which sometimes will happen in Chassidut. Chassidut is a jam. This is like if you like jam band music or if you like jazz, Chassidus is like Coltrane, interstellar space. Okay, this is just like they're jamming on all these verses and they're just throwing them back and forth. Everybody knows every verse by heart, and they're expecting you to pick up on the tonality of how they improvise. So the improvisation is really an important part, as is the juxtaposition. As I said, he's bringing Pirkei Avot here at the beginning of Acharei Mot because you're already in the zone with him. Okay? And a lot of it's not being unpacked. But let me just finish one little piece here.
Let me bring that screen back up. But let me ask a question, whether it's fair, because you talked about the elitism and the I'll call the overly cerebral turn that that the Hasidic revival itself took, right, and the Kabbalah got, and there's a way it feels to me that this school, this approach, and a fair bit of the Hasidic masters who I appreciate are actually trying to create a community that is doing what the study materials point to, whereas that over-cerebral approach is actually withdrawing people. Even though it understands it at this very high intellectual level, it's completely divorced from the very subject matter it's trying to teach.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's very fair, and it's a very good observation, is that they were concerned with how does the text take us back to the experience. They want, and this is the language of Hergesh, they want to feel it. It's not just a cerebral exercise. Some of the greatest sichos that come from the Chabad Rebbes is so completely complex and so much in the cognitive sphere of the mind of the Rebbe that leads you to bliss out and to trip away into a whole other world. But it's all mind based. It's totally brilliant. But it's not about having the hergesh. It's about having the hasaga of getting and understanding where the Rebbe is going, and it blows your mind open, the way that a Zen Quan would, but in a very, very, very complex way. This is about getting back to the experience. And I want to just say, Eve brought up in the chat an interesting question: is Malchut the Shekhinah or immanent within this translation? So yes, she is synonymous with Malchut. He doesn't refer to her here as Shekhinah. He and the Kalisker are very concerned with the Shekhinah, and one of the reasons why they have gone to the trouble of making Aliyah to Eretz HaKodesh is because they want to be closer to the Shekhinah. They see the land as the hovering, neighboring presence of the Shekhinah in a very real and embodied way, which is another conversation for the time. But yes, that is there and that is operating. So just to go back to those souls, the subtle level is the inner soul, whereas the gross level is the outer soul, which is here referring to a series of clusters of spheres within Kabbalah. So just hold with me for a moment here. If you know Kabbalah, you'll get it, and if you don't know it, then you'll just appreciate what's being condensed into this allusion, and what he's referring to and pointing to. So in terms of the manifestation of divine consciousness, that the highest sphere is called Keter. Okay, so Keter is the causal realm, but the subtle realm from Chokhmah all the way down, that is the sphere of primordial wisdom, all the way down to Yesod, which is the nexus. That's considered to be the subtle realm, and he is only really primarily referring here to the ultimate sphere, which is the gross sphere of Malchut. Gross in the sense of being most unrefined, right? The subtlest is really in Keter, and then we move from causal to subtle, and ultimately to um, to the gross level. But here, when we refer to the inner and the outer, the inner is all about subtlety and refinement, whereas the outer realm really is in the place of Malchut, which is the ground of our being. It's the eminent sphere, which Eve pointed to, and as Reb David says, it's the outer human realm. I wouldn't call it human, but I know what you mean. It's in the sense of it's the embodied realm, and it's the place where we have the closest glimmer. That's why I called it the neighboring presence. And when you're in the community in Tiberias, when you're in a song circle or in a nigun circle, you're in the realm where the Shekhinah is hovering at her most imminent. Right? You're feeling the vibrations of the Shekhinah, but is it the human realm itself? It's that moment of almost touching and not touching, what's called mati velo mati, right? It's a very delicate, even though it's the gross level, it's the place where we can begin to launch and to take off. So should we go a tiny bit further?
I think we should, but I also want to do timekeeping. So let's try to do 10 minutes more for text, and that'll give us 15 more minutes then for question and answer. Perfect. And for people listening, I know this, as always, every single one of our classes, there's like a low. Here we are talking about the non-cerebral experiences, and we're doing it in this conversational way, and it's loaded with info. So if you didn't get confused along the way, you're not paying enough attention. That's a line I like to use. And if you did, just jot that down, your questions along, so that you've captured it, and we'll be able to do that. Okay, Steve, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Steve Ishikoch. So let's just do a few more minutes on this reflection on the inner soul, and then I want to take it to something else to kind of conclude. And as Reb David said, this is not a cerebral exercise. This is meant for practice and for you to take into your own practice, and for us to look at the end of this parsha, the way that I've set it up. I give questions for reflection in your own practice. But here, the inner soul was not created to serve the body. Instead, the body and the supporting spiritual elements that pertain to it were created to serve the inner soul. Right? The body, the goof, was meant to serve the inner soul and to act according to its influences in order to be elevated by it, and thus to evolve through its guidance. So what he's concerned about is that as soon as a person degrades his or her own inner guiding soul through immersion in creaturely desires and appetites, that person becomes identified with and lost in the confusion of the gross outer soul. Right? Hava mitpalel b'shalom shel malchut. Your prayer needs to be focused on that, maintaining that feedback loop, that synergistic process. That at all times, what's happening is that you are allowing the body and for libidinal desire of the outer soul to be able to be elevating the inner soul. And as such, when you do this, yeah, go ahead.
Finish your thought.
Okay, I'll just finish the sentence. As such, when a person is no longer fulfilling his or her human potential to be a higher animal, which would then swallow one another alive, the energies available in this inner level are appropriated off and misused by outer influences, meaning that that inner soul can sometimes be overwhelmed by the allure of the world to the extent that he or she ceases to be functioning with intentionality and with kavanah. That verse that is being highlighted there is really focusing on the tension that really exists here in this moment, and the need to really be able to care for the inner soul. It's like just to make sure that light, that inner light, doesn't become extinguished by all the schmutz that accumulates on the outer soul, right? That one would swallow another one up alive is going back to the earlier teaching of Pirkei Avot, right? The whole teaching was, Rabbi China would say, pray for the welfare of the regime, but for fear of it, people would swallow one another up alive, right? If it wasn't for the regime, if it wasn't for Malchut, then people would just completely swallow each other up alive. And it's a political, spiritual insight that's being recontextualized here to say that if you don't take care of yourself on the level of Malchut, your soul will be distracted, misused, and it will ultimately be diminished. And there's great potential for what you can do on the place of Malchut. Don't let it be diminished. Don't be distressed by the tension, but allow that feedback loop to elevate.
Beautiful, beautiful. One of the metaphors that we were playing with for this was actually 12-step, right? Because there's a way, right? Because sometimes it's very easy for us to forget the ways that we are controlled, and trying to make that real, right? We need to have some way of grasping it. And the 12-step says that basically my innerness has been swallowed up from a whole series of events, right? And I have been so seduced that I can't actually. It's so hard for me to get back. And there is this ascent, right? That part of the healing process that occurs in a 12-step program is an ascent that is reconnecting, right, to these finer states of being, right? On
After you've bottomed out.
Yes, right.
Right.
And so this is operating ideally at a much higher level that we don't get to that point. But I think the map of how we operate is still accurate in a certain way. So
yes, I think that there's a lot of interesting cross conversations with things like the 12-step, with TM, with Vedanta. There's a whole bunch of different ways of looking at it and parsing it. But what here, like on page 304, just to shift for a moment, because I want to bring it back into your lives. I've set up a series of questions for reflection that invite spiritual practice and journaling. I don't know if you have that. Oh, you do have it. Great. Wonderful. Thanks, David. So at the end of each parsha, aside from having an introduction, Nehemiah and I and Miles have kind of worked together in conversation with these types of questions. And so I just want to invite, not to prescribe, but actually just to invite, if you take for a moment, just take a breath and look at each of these questions. And if any of them bring something up for you that you want to share or to note in your own practice, in your own experience, in your own feeling of what it means to be a spiritual being. If any of these speak to you, and if you want to just share for a moment and respond in your own experience, in your own spiritual journey, what this opens for you, or perhaps a struggle or a challenge that emerges from this highly refined and subtle description of the inner soul and the outer soul, or the oversoul and the undersoul.
And what I'm going to do, I'm going to put these questions into chat so that we can close that up and look at each other's faces as well.
Great.
So there's number one.
And this is a model, just as we're talking, I want to give Hakarat Hatov. I've also been in conversation with and spent many years learning with the Institute for Jewish Spirituality that Art Green and Jonathan Omerman, who was one of my first meditation teachers, was a part of, along with Sheila Weinberg-Peltz and Rachel Cowan, of blessed memory. So Jonathan Slater, who has been teaching there for many years, when he would teach Hasidic texts, he would bring these questions for reflection as a way of saying, okay, now that we've gone through this material, how does this relate to our practice? And the shidduch that happened that really kind of got me on fire spiritually around Tiberius was at an IJS retreat where I first met Nehemiah Poland probably 15 years ago at the Trinity Retreat Center up in northern Connecticut, the strangest of all places, where he brought us the power of the Nigun, which really just completely, I felt that like it was an electric current that just completely jump-started my soul, restarted it. And then he also introduced me to Volume 4, which is the teachings of Zvi Hershov Tzmoirich in the Ketem Paz, which was really supposed to be what this whole project was about. I only set out to do one volume. But I realized as I was going through this ecstatic manual on the prayer, Baruch She'amar, blessed be the one who spoke and the world came into being, I started going through this text, and I was just like, first of all, it was a whole Indiana Jones story of getting the critical manuscript together so it could actually be legible and readable. That was a whole Indiana Jones story. I finally got it done, and then I helped the publisher who was sitting on it in Jerusalem publish a new edition in Hebrew that was not corrupted but actually read properly, because a lot of the transmission was corrupted. And then eventually I was working with Nehemiah, who introduced me to it, and we said, okay, we figured the text out finally after years of reflecting on it together. And I said, great, let's just publish this one. And I said, I don't think people aren't going to grok it, because you don't really understand Zvi Hershov Tzmoirich until you understand his teacher. Who was his teacher? Avraham HaKohen of Kalisk. You need to know the Kalisker who was doing the somersaults. But you don't really understand the Kalisker. So I went through all the Kalisker's writings, and I said, you're not really going to understand the Kalisker unless you understand his co-leader in the Minyan, Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. And that's when I opened up the Pandora's box, and I found myself like 15 years later that I haven't been able to leave Tiberias, because I only, in these 500 pages of the book, I just took selected drashot from his book that's called Pri Haaretz, The Fruit of the Land. But it was a way of trying to get to this very small volume, which is a commentary on ecstatic prayer, as a way of kind of opening it up. And so I'd use that just as a way of saying that all of them had very deep spiritual experiences that were very much acknowledged and affirmed and supported in the community of Tiberias. I think primarily one of the reasons why is because of the structure of the community itself, which was radically horizontal. They practiced something that we learn about in their letters of correspondence, as well as in the Kalisker's writings, something that was called the Book Chaverim, which is a topic for another discussion another time, but basically means mystical friendship. That if you're down, right, if I'm down in the dumps right now, I just connect my neshama cord to Reb David, and he lifts me up. And if he's down, he connects it to Peter. And if Peter's down, he connects it to Laura and to Barbara and to Sherry. And we just make these extension cords that go all the way around, kind of like those, the great patio lights that you put onto your porch. And you flick the switch and everything just lights up. Even though one of those bulbs may be schwach and burn out, the light, the luminescence that comes from that circle, which is about the sounds that envelop the community in ecstatic prayer, the sound of Torah study, the sound and the resonance of dance, all these things that are happening, that is what is the core practice of this community, is about how we relate to each other in a horizontal way. There is no Rebbe of the community. That's something that for me was really appealing. Not because I want to put myself out of a job, but because, as Reb Zalman would say, even within the place of Rebbehood, there needs to be in our day and age an understanding of the alternation of that role, that everyone gets to play that role and to be in that place of moving the chayut and the spirit around the circle. That's what led to models like Chavarat Shalom and other elements of the Chavra movement, which were really, again, an iteration, knowingly and unknowingly, because Art Green was a part of that, so he knew this already. It was knowingly a part of these radically horizontal communities that really wanted to practice mystical friendship and to say that together we uplift each other. And it's not about a vertical relationship to a Rebbe sitting on a chair in a kiseh in the courtyard where you come with your kvitlach and with your petitions, and you are able to elevate through the agency of the Rebbe, which is a legitimate form of spiritual practice, which has also become problematized in our own day and age for a variety of reasons. But in its own time, already by the third generation of Taklaz, the Vitebsk and the Kalisker were saying, I'm not sure where this thing is going, but I don't like the signs of it. I don't like the way this is going, and it already feels like it's becoming too institutionalized and too rigid, so that by a generation and a half later, or a half generation later, who is it that comes onto the scene in Bratslav and Uman? The great Einiklach, the Alter Einiklach of the Baal Shem Tov, Reb Nachman of Breslov, who does his utmost to be a religious anarchist and to upend everything that has become institutionalized in the Hasidic world because they've forgotten the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And by the way, you'll see in volume 2, if you're interested, Reb Nachman of Breslov, the great Hasidic anarchist, what does he do? He goes to Tveria, and guess who he meets? The Kalisker. And the Shabbos they spent in Tveria is shrouded in mystery. It was an ecstatic Shabbos that we're still trying to decode. And it's fitting that these two Hasidic anarchists, I call them anarchists because they were challenging the status quo, what was becoming institutionalized, and what was turning into a religion. It was never meant to become a religion, right? Max Weber talks about that the charismatic leader founds an experience that's shared with the original co-patriots and disciples. Once that becomes fixed into an institution, it becomes a religion. And then the new charismatic leader has to, we call that the break-off minion, right? That's what we do nowadays. We just have another break-off minion. But these Hasidim, especially the Vitebsker and the Kalsker, put their money where their mouth is. They set sail, and they left it all behind because they wanted to create or to recreate and to recapture the powerful feeling of Hasidic community and ethos in ecstatic prayer and study, in dance and solitude and in silence, in a way that was challenging the institutionalizing forms of dynastic succession that were taking over Eastern European Hasidic sects by and large that they were leaving behind.
All right, so let's just thank you, and I just want to make sure if people have any questions, comments, thoughts, inspirations, whether you want to address one of the questions that's in chat or something else, please do.
I'll talk. I just want to say that I'm totally blown away. This is the future of the survival of Am Yisrael. Is what we're talking about here, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, and it's just very exciting. I was unaware of this lineage, frankly, and I'm very excited to learn more about this parallel. I love your terminology. I'm very familiar, of course, with the Chabad, the classic Chabad lineage that we all hear about. I'm fascinated, and I want to learn more. That's all I have to say. Okay.
No, I think it's great that you're excited about it, Sherry. I know that you care a lot about your community, and it's interesting to look at different leadership models and to be self-reflective, and to realize that, like, the same way that, how do we put up a mezuzah nowadays? Think about that for a moment, talking about the horizontal and the vertical, right? What have we done? Zecher lamachloket. Some say it goes like this, some say it goes like this. So what do we do? In memory of the controversy of being undecided, we put it like this on an angle. So I think that there's something to learn about also achieving what the Baal Shem Tov speaks about as hishtavut. Like, how do we apply this in our spiritual lives as individuals and as communities into a place that will bring greater and deeper equanimity, to integrate this in a way that brings Shlomo Shel Malchut, that the ground of my being is in a place of deeper. I'm reading Shlomo as integration, as a deeper kind of integral Judaism that we are yearning for. We know, all of us know, that have been frustrated with the communal models that we've seen, or that we've grown up with, or that we've walked away with, or that we've come back to and tried to renew. We know there's something more going on, but as Dylan says, that we just don't know what it is, right? There's something going on, but we just don't know what it is. That's the place where we're at right now, and we're at a liminal moment that's very exciting, and that's why I've dedicated so much time to collecting these texts, both with the critical Hebrew edition in the back, as well as these intercalated translations and a reader's guide, because I want to open up this treasure chest to spiritual seekers, to people in Jewish communities and beyond, for them to be able to say, this is something that can impact my spiritual life, and ultimately it's important. And Kathleen just asked a really interesting question. Very interesting. Yeah. So should we read Kathleen's question? How are the inner soul and the outer soul connected? I'm thinking of a parallel to the gap or to the no thing. Yes. So it's very interesting.
Just as background for those who's joining us, right? One of the Vitebska's concepts is that we go, in order to change, we have to reconnect with the ground of being, right? Of God, of emptiness, of ayin, of nothingness. And there's this moment where we're neither fish nor fowl, where there's this transitional moment. And so that's what's being asked here. There is a relationship between that phase of transformation and these two sides of our nature.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. And it's such an important question. I encourage you to go back over the introduction as well as the rest of the drasha, which I haven't been able to give justice to, but Reb David's been studying with your group for a while. But in there, he specifically refers to that experience of the transformation from ayin to ani, right? That is to say, to go into that place where the soul is beginning that process of transformation into the place of nothingness, which is the highest causal realm, which is also a name for Keter. And he says, forget about the mumbo jumbo. He says, I'm going into a lot of technical terminology of insider baseball. He says, no, go back to the Maggid of Mezrich's famous explanation of it. It's the moment where you take a seedling and you put it into the earth. And if you had like a microscopic, camera that could go under the earth and watch what happens in what's it called? Not in slow motion, but in what's that called when it sort of speeds up and you see the process
time lapse.
Yeah, time lapse photography. So if you watch the time lapse photography, thank you, David. If you watch the time lapse of what happens to the moment where you put the seed into the earth and then eventually the shell that contains the seed ends up decomposing, that's the process of the self going into the place of ayin, decomposing. But in the process, it's a micro moment within the journey of the soul. There is that gap. There is that moment where the I is no thing in the process of transforming and elevating to becoming something more within the ani, the anochiyut of myself that is elevated. And that's another way of talking about it, is the inner and the outer soul. If you think about the seedling in that way, it's that's the pun that Reb David points to in the chat, is something that was common in Hasidic literature as well, is that if you want to become more of a really integrated ani, of a person, of a selfhood, you have to go into the place of ayin. And it's a constant toggling back and forth. You can talk about ani ve'ayin, you can talk about inner soul and outer soul, but it's a dance. That's another thing that's really important, is it has to be seen and felt as a dance, and we're going to talk about that in volume 6. I'm working with Walter Feldman now, who's an expert in Ashkenazic music. He's an ethnomusicologist who I've been in conversation with about the Baal Shem Tov since my days in the Hungarian pastry shop in the Upper West Side, and we used to sit and talk together and schmooze, and he would start dancing in the middle of the pastry shop, showing me what Hasidic dance was really meant to be. You know him probably from Klez Camp, right? Some of you know him from Klez Camp. He is one of the greatest living masters who understands how dance is in the Hasidic world is related to nigun. It's related to inflection of the sound, what's called intonatia, as well as movement and breath. And all those things are integrated, and that's the way that I see this relationship between inner soul and outer soul, and we have to relearn the steps to that dance. Go ahead. That's who's up there, Laura?
Yeah. So this question is kind of for both of you Rebbes. So what does all of this knowledge say to us as conservative Jews?
Ooh, I love it. First of all, I love the fact that you say both of you Rebbes, and we're both musmachim from conservative institutions. So, Reb David, what do you think? Should we get ready to go to Tiberias together?
You know what? I was getting ready to go, and then this pandemic came and stopped it. So I am well ready again. I'll take a stab first. Look, I think the Kabbalistic Map is a fractal that exists at every order of existence. So it outlines God and God's entering into every aspect of being. It's a map of the human soul and how we operate in the same way, from those glimmers of our intuition down to the most gross, that word gross, the largest, our bodily functions, our corporeality. And it's a sociologically true also, this fractal. And so on the one hand, right, there's a lot of ways in which normative religious communities are occupying the outer body, right? The nefesh habehemi. We're focused on our existential needs, our fundraising, our building, our life cycles, our basic education, all of these. And they're essential, right? That nefesh habehemi, as Vitebsker says, is absolutely essential, but it's essential in order to feed, right? The nefesh hasikli, right? That higher potentiality that we have. And as a movement, right, we're in a tension, because I think we're discovering that there is that dynamic happening. That, look, there was a point in 1950, right? Abraham Joshua Heschel talked about just how absolutely dull and boring our prayer services were. And it took 70 years, and you talk about how long it takes for, large movements to shift, right, for that to happen. And we ain't there yet, certainly in Portland, right? I mean, there are ways that Portland, if we're all Portlandia, we're kind of locked into certain things. So I think the question is, for the conservative movement, the question is, how do we make space for those who are hungry, not for the outer, but for that inner, how do we make sure that there's spaces and experiential opportunities and this class, for this to occur. And at the same time, you can't neglect the nefesh habehemi, right? And when there have been attempts to do that, right, you look at the renewal movement, in certain ways, it was an attempt to no, we don't want that outer at all, and it never got legs, right? And I remember conversations with Reb Zalman of blessed memory, right? That's not a critique, right? We all, if you look sociologically, we're all occupying aspects of this. And